I picked it because, obviously it's relevant to what's going on
That's right.
today.
Yeah.
Defunding the police and abolishing prisons are not the same, but they're definitely
Related.
related. And I had sort of vaguely become aware of prison abolition in the past few years, and I felt like when it's presented in a superficial format, so like in a podcast, there's a certain script that it always has, which is you talk about how bad prisons are, which I think it's hard to deny when you look at the facts, and then you get to maybe we can let nonviolent people out of prison, especially drug offenders, and then it always comes to the point where the skeptic asks, what about the rapists and what about the murderers? What do we do about rapists and murderers? And so, and the response from people in the prison abolition movement, again, in my experience, had been, well, there's a lot of scholarship about this. It's not like no one has ever considered that question before. You should read up on it. So I wanted to read up on it. I'll say, if you haven't read this book and this is a topic that you're at all interested in, I definitely recommend it. It's a pretty short book. It's sort of academic in its tone, but it doesn't feel like a textbook at all. It should definitely, it makes it easy to read. I'll admit that I was aware of Angela Davis as a revolutionary, but I did not know much about her. So if you were in the same boat as me at all, she was born in 1944 in Birmingham. So, deep Jim Crow South. She grew up to be an activist and an educator. She got fired from UCLA for her radical views. She was a member of the Black Panthers, and she joined an all-Black Communist Party. And then in 1970, there were 3 Black Panthers who escaped from a courtroom where they were being held for trial. She was not one of them, but she was charged with helping them escape. And she was eventually acquitted, but it was after spending 18 months in probably jail, maybe prison, but behind bars, detained for 18 months. I'm sure that informs this book, but she only directly mentions it once, which maybe we will talk about. So that was 1970 to 1971, and then for context, this book came out in 2003. So early on in the book, she sort of introduces the scope of the problem and talks about the, reform versus abolition. Like, can we make prisons better? And she asserts her belief that we can't, that there are immediate changes we can make on the margins, but that the injustices run so deep that the only solution is prison abolition. She shares a couple of stories, particularly how in California, where she was living, the populations of prisons just exploded starting in the 80s. And that was related to the war on drugs. It was related to Ronald Reagan. And she raises, but to me, I think is this really interesting point, was just that we have all given our implicit consent to this system, right? Like, we don't really stop and think about what prisons are for. When she learned that in the late 60s there were 300,000 Americans in prison, that shocked her. And she thought, well, if it ever got any worse than that, the people would rise up. I mean, either we succumb to fascism or we don't allow any more Americans to go behind bars. And now it's gone from 300,000 to 2.3 million. This, I thought, was really striking. She points out that other than when we got involved in major wars, mass incarceration has been the most thoroughly implemented government social program of our time. So way bigger than things that might actually have beneficial effects on people's lives are the infrastructure that goes into arresting and charging and detaining and probation and parole of prisoners. She writes this, which stuck with me. On the whole, people tend to take prisons for granted. It's difficult to imagine life without them. At the same time, there is reluctance to face the realities hidden within them, a fear of thinking outside them. Thus, the prison is present in our lives, and at the same time, it is absent from our lives. And it's hard to deny that, right? I mean, we have compartmentalized the kind of people that are in prison, that they are a class of people that we think of as criminals or evildoers, and that makes whatever goes on in there okay. Let me say too, if you want to jump in with a comment or question at any time, don't let me stop you. But we'll also just do discussion at the end too. So, in chapter 2, she starts talking more deeply about race, and specifically how slavery leads directly into Jim Crow and then to mass incarceration. And that's a narrative that certainly, I'd heard about. But if you in any way thought of that as like a metaphor or hyperbole, that really doesn't seem to be the case. So, there were certain laws regarding slavery known as the Slave Code, and slavery gets abolished. Those laws go away, but discrimination against Black people is still completely legal, totally on the table. So the slave codes just become the Black codes. And then you can criminalize anything. So, a poor Black man who was just freed from slavery, right? He's starting off with nothing. Maybe he gets a job and he shows up late for work. He could be arrested for that. And if you went into the prison system under those conditions, slavery was leading directly into this convict leasing system, which in many ways was considered to be worse, right? So speaking on a purely cold economic level, if you own a slave, that's an expensive piece of property, right? Most white people that lived in the South were way too poor to own another person. And so you've got at least some financial incentive to keep that person alive and healthy enough to work. But if you are renting bodies from the prison, if you are getting labor for them that they're not getting paid for, you get 20 strong men working a field and one of them works himself to death, that's not really a net economic loss to you. And so the treatment in a lot of ways was considered even worse under the convict leasing system than it had been under slavery. And one example that she cites, so prior to the Civil War, there were labor prisons and chain gangs in Alabama, and they were 99% white. Overwhelmingly only had white people in them. By 1870, so 5 years after the end of the Civil War, then we had those same chain gangs were overwhelmingly Black, right? So to solve this problem of where to get the free labor, you can turn a certain class of people into criminals, and then you can do with them what you want, right? I mean, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery unless you're convicted of a crime. And so it's what Frederick Douglass referred to as imputing crime to color. And it started a stereotype that persists to this day. She draws this interesting parallel, like abolition of slavery by a lot of people was considered unthinkable, right? And so even Abraham Lincoln, who ended up freeing the slaves, at certain points in his political career expressed that he wished there wasn't slavery, but also that he didn't see how they could get rid of it. And now we look back and it would be unthinkable to talk in the realm, the marketplace of ideas about putting people in chains in terms of slavery, right? So something that seemed impossible until it wasn't, and then in retrospect looks inevitable, like it was definitely what was always going to happen. And obviously history is more complicated and more interesting than that. The chapter on race does focus mostly on Black people and ex-slaves, but she does not leave out Muslims. You know, this came out in 2003, so we're talking early post 9/11, early war on terror, the way that Native Americans in this country have, I mean, on top of everything else, have been incarcerated at much higher rates, white people. And then this, to me, was one of the most interesting pieces of background that I think it's not only just interesting, but it's super relevant to today, because when prisons first come along, they are the progressive alternative of a criminal justice system. So they were creating prisons to replace capital punishment or corporal punishment, killing or beating or setting people on fire. And so penitentiaries, as they're known, are only about as old as the United States, because around the same time that people around the world started to accept, that white men at least had certain inalienable rights and were created equal. That was when we started to reimagine being held in detention as a right that the state can take away, right? So if you didn't have inalienable rights, then there's nothing to take away. It takes the sort of post-Enlightenment ideals to get us to that place. And so the penitentiary is called that because the idea is that people are going to repent, that a man can learn to be better. A lot of Quakers and other forward-thinking Christians led this movement to put people into isolation and reflection so that they could repent and grow. She writes, before the acceptance of the sanctity of individual rights, imprisonment could not have been understood as punishment. So if the individual was not perceived as possessing inalienable rights and liberties, then the alienation of those rights and liberties by removal from society would not have made sense. Banishment beyond the geographical limits of the town may have made sense, but not the alteration of the individual's legal status through imposition of a prison sentence. So prior to this movement, people were only detained for as long as it took to act out their punishment, their very public hanging or burning alive or whatever it was, because you wanted to send a message to everybody else. The detention wasn't thought of as the punishment yet. So she quotes Charles Dickens at length because he visited one of the early penitentiaries, and he talks about the horrifying conditions that people were under, and that it was he says it's done with the best of intentions, but what it actually leads to is driving men mad, that they are kept alone for 23 hours a day or whatever, in terrible conditions. And he stresses that besides the fact that that's inhumane, it's not going to make anybody better. She follows up that quote with another lengthy quote from a government report about solitary confinement today, and they are so similar. I mean, we're talking about 150 plus years later, we're talking about the same things, right? But we've gotten rid of the idea that we're even trying to make people better. So she writes, no one, not even the most ardent defenders of a supermax prison, so the most restrictive prisons, would try to argue today that absolute segregation, including sensory deprivation, is restorative and healing. The prevailing justification for a supermax prison is that the horrors it creates are the perfect complement for the horrifying personalities deemed the worst of the worst by the prison system. So we're not even ending a reform anymore. And that's manifested itself in all these different, much easier. It used to be to get education. You used to be able to get a college degree in a lot of penitentiaries or do writing programs. And I think we had, I'm blanking on her name, but she teaches, Deborah Devine. She teaches to prisoners. She teaches writing to prisoners. But the crime bill of 1994 that Joe Biden was a champion of cut any kind of money from the federal government for prisoners to get education. And just speaking from our own experience, it's really hard, because we're a bookstore, it's really hard to send books to people in prison. We get asked about that a lot because you can't mail your loved one a book. It has to be a new book that comes from a bookstore, and it can't have a hardcover, and certain titles are restricted. So education has just gotten more and more difficult to come by, and the idea of reform has just, in a lot of ways, fallen by the wayside.
I wonder Can I
Yeah.
ask you, Bryce? I haven't gotten to this part yet. Maybe she talks about it, but along the lines of, Dickens going into the prison, I wonder when it started to become a piece of public discussion of corporal punishment. Because if, prisons originally were for detainment, for repentance before you were murdered by the state,
Right.
I wonder when that started to be kind of a thing that was like, I wonder what, I wonder,
Yeah.
if this isn't the right way to deal with, prisoners, and if when they started thinking that like maybe killing everybody is not the best thing to do.
Yeah.
Right. That's a good question, and she doesn't specifically talk about that. Since you've read like half of it, that first chapter, she starts talking about how most places most industrialized countries don't have a death penalty anymore. They would see that as not the role of the state to take away someone's life is in retaliation for a crime. Whereas Indiana executed, 2 people since the pandemic started. It's a good question. I don't know the answer to it. Because we have the Constitution has or the Bill of Rights, a protection from cruel and unusual punishment. But I think, right, at the time, being put into stocks was not considered particularly cruel or unusual. So
Yeah,
I
the
don't know.
definition is really changing.
Yeah.
Very fluid.
It continues to evolve, and I think it's worth thinking about that, right? Like, we would think it was unthinkable to whip someone in the public square because they stole something, but it was how things were done for a very long time, and people accepted that.
Well, even
yeah, sorry.
even in the probably the first 30 years in the state of Indiana, they had what they called indeterminate sentences, which meant somebody could go to the penitentiary and they wouldn't have a specific amount of time. It would be up to the warden and maybe the parole board of how long they were there. And supposedly it was like a carrot and stick thing, that if you behaved yourself that you would get out earlier, but it really ended up not being that. It was a political, who could pay the money into the parole board to get themselves out early. So, I mean, that's not that long ago again.
It's not that long ago, and there are ways in which that persists, like you just alluded to. I mean, there are essentially 2 different criminal justice systems when you can afford really good representation, or when you tend white, tend male, tend heterosexual, tend cis. And I think these are the kinds of fundamental insidious problems that makes Angela Davis so skeptical of the idea that we can improve prisons to the point where they are morally defensible. There's a very interesting chapter on gender and how gender structures the prison system. The book's from 2003, so it's very binary in terms of men and women. There's nothing about trans people or non-binary people, but she talks about how for a long time women were mostly exempt from incarceration because you can't take civil rights away from someone who doesn't have them. Like when you marry, you take your husband's name and you go through a kind of civil death, and there's nothing to there's no inalienable rights to forfeit. That said, whereas the deviant behavior of men was criminalized and punished, the deviant behavior of women was often considered insane, was institutionalized or drugged out of their minds, or burned at the stake as a witch. I mean, they were 2 separate tracks that manifested in different ways. And then when you start to see female prisons do develop, quick bit of trivia, the first reform school for women in the United States was founded in Indiana in 1853. But what they focus on is teaching domestic skills, cooking, cleaning, laundry, and the sense that they are going to surrender to the appropriate gender roles, and that's going to be what sets them straight. And so the female deviants almost always had this sexual component to it, right? Like even like the word hysteria, the same root as hysterectomy, the idea that women are sometimes driven crazy by lust, and they can't control themselves. They were not considered candidates for reform in the way that men were. They were fallen women. They couldn't. There was no penitence for them to do. She quotes Assata Shakur at length, who another Black Panther who went to prison for involvement in the shooting of a state trooper, although she didn't actually touch the gun. And she talks in length about invasive strip searches. And this is the one time when she brings her own experience into it explicitly and says, yeah, that's what happens. And that happens on a daily basis. There's a story about a convention of correctional officers, and some protesters storm the stage, and they strip search each other, the protesters. And of course the audience finds this disgusting and inappropriate and totally foul. But when you look at that in a different context, that's what was happening. That's what these correctional officers are doing and were doing in prisons on a daily basis. And you either submit to a deep cavity search or you go into solitary confinement. And, nobody wants that. That's just going to drive you insane. And so this isn't something that I'm familiar with, but she mentions this weird phenomenon where people point out the disparities between men and women's incarceration, and the response, instead of improving conditions for men to match women's prisons, is to say that we should make women's prisons even worse. That true equality would be for all of them to be treated like human garbage or whatever. So we come to the heart of one of the key reasons why it's so difficult to get out of the prison system, so hard to imagine a world without it, and it's what she refers to as the prison industrial complex, just like Eisenhower's military industrial complex. So the problem isn't just that there are so many prisons, although there are so many industries that support those prisons, and things that I would never have considered, like the catering and the hygiene and the uniforms that they wear and the telecommunications. I mean, people are making it increasingly difficult to talk to prisoners. It's really expensive to put calls in and out of prison. But even though a relatively small percentage of prisoners are in private prisons, she does single that out as a particular problem, because these are for-profit detention centers. And so instead of a state owning and operating a prison, they give a contract to a private company who builds the prison, and then the government is essentially leasing it back to them. So they're making money per prisoner. So two problems with that. One is that you can't really fire them because they built and owned the property that this prison is on. But the second is that there's this profit, the capitalism, the profit motive. Year over year, you have to increase profits, and your raw material is human beings. And that leaves you with two choices: to continue to gouge them further, and or to increase the populations within the prisons, to get more people inside. Crime rates have fallen pretty continuously since the mid-90s, right? Since the crime wave that prompted the crime bill that we were talking about earlier, but prison populations have just continued to go up since then. So that's a quick and dirty version of the history and the theory that go into it. We finally get to the last chapter, and it is about abolitionist alternatives. And this is where I was going to get my, okay, what do we do? If we're imagining an alternative to prisons, what do we do with the rapists and murderers? And she doesn't answer that question. She mentions that question, and then she says, there's a lot of scholarship out there. You should read some of the things that are being proposed. And so I came into this thinking, oh, this book's going to answer my questions, and now I feel like I just need to read more books. She does tell an interesting, ends on an interesting anecdote about some parents whose daughter was murdered, and they came to forgive the men that did it and work together to create programs to prevent it from happening in the future, to get them out of prison. A sense of restorative justice is what we started to call it. But there's not enough room in that chapter. There's not enough length to the book to talk about how you could do that on a bigger scale, or if you could do that on a bigger scale. But the broad strokes are this. The broad strokes of a prison abolition, well, there's a couple things. One is, this is her assertion, if you closed the prisons tomorrow and let all the people out, so if you replaced prisons with nothing, that would still be better than what we have now. And I know how counterintuitive that sounds, but I also think that there's a lot of evidence to back that up. I mean, we don't have studies that suggest prisons deter people from crimes. We do have studies that suggest people become more criminal or more violent, right? I mean, the main drivers of violence are things like shame, isolation, proximity to violence, your inability to make an economic future for yourself. And prison exemplifies all of those things. My sister's best friend from high school struggled with addiction forever. And finally, when she got her third DUI, was sent to prison. And that it was just on the weekends because she was working and a mother. She would just go check into the prisons on the weekend. And perhaps not unsurprisingly, that prison term did not solve her addiction problems, but they did help her meet people who were drug connections. Mm-hmm. So that was at the end of last year. And 2 months ago, she got out and she overdosed. She's dead now. And, I can't say that that's a direct result or that she wouldn't have got there in the first place. But that's one of the things that Angela Davis is strictly advocating for. So to get to a society that doesn't have prisons, we have to create a society that doesn't need one. And it's a step-by-step process. It's incremental, and it involves decriminalizing drugs and getting real help for people with addictions instead of punishing them. Decriminalizing sex work. Stop criminalizing crossing the border without the right papers. Getting people mental health care. She mentions that there are more people in prison who have severe mental health problems than there are in mental institutions. And that's just a direct result of where we've chosen to put down, where we've chosen to put resources as a society. So overall, it's the beginnings of imagining a sort of top-down revision of society where we no longer require prisons because we take care of people, help them to be healthy and safe, and yeah, I mean, I'm convinced by a lot of what she says, and I'm definitely intrigued to know more about a lot of it. But that is I wouldn't say brief, but that is my recap of everything in the book. So let me open it up if anybody has anything they want to add, anything I forgot or got wrong or want to ask about.
I listened to a podcast with a prison abolitionist activist named Mariam Kaba. And one of the really interesting alternatives that she was putting forth was I can't remember exactly what she called it, but essentially it was victim-driven reparations. So like if somebody steals from you or somebody wrongs you in some way, the person who received the action decides, while being in contact with the person who committed the crime, what do I need from this person to make me feel like, make me feel like it's been solved or have some sort of closure. Because, one of her points was that people who are victims of crimes also don't feel relief from our criminal justice system. A lot of people don't feel relief that this person is now going to spend the entire rest of their life in jail or something like that. Like that does not solve their issue, you know? So, and the fact that like it was more of a deterrent in their studies that they've shown that the person who committed the crime then has to face the person who they had committed the crime against. They were much less likely to commit another crime if they knew they were going to have to look that person in the face afterwards and say, I'm sorry. You know, it was really a powerful idea. I can't imagine having killed somebody's family member and having to look at them and, you know, express some sort of remorse towards them. Just seems, ugh.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it seems much more healing than, you know, to be able to then like work through those emotions than to just be like, okay, bye. In 30 years, have fun in there. It's going to be.
I mean, I go back to the Larry Nassar, the thing that was on Netflix, the doctors of the team gymnasts that, you know, went on and on and on for so many years with sexual abuse. So what do you do with somebody like that?
Yeah.
I mean,
No.
it's tough questions.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with you. And God knows that nobody wants him to have access to, you know, I mean, in that case, if you ask someone, why would we lock him up? It's because we don't want him out on the street. We don't want him to have the potential to do that again. Yeah, I mean, it's a tough question, and it's a really tough, it really challenges your social imagination of what is possible.
Yeah, and part of that specific issue is how did we create a society in which these women didn't feel like they could tell anybody what was happening to them, that they were so under the power of this man that they did not feel like, you know, that they could come forward about any of it. You know, it's a much more complicated solution to deal with things like that than to, you know, than to not, I mean, basically just not look at it again. That's what the prison system is. You put them in there and then you just don't have to look at it again.
Yeah, you lock the doors and forget about them. Yeah.
And I guess like whenever the question of like, what do we do with the rapists and murderers comes up, like it doesn't really answer the question, but I always think about like the solve rate for those kinds of cases. It's like, okay, but it's like, Edie, she's really interested in this discussion. It's like what, maybe half of murders get solved?
Yeah.
And it's like how many, you know, out of, you know, rapes and sexual assaults that are reported, how many even get, you know, investigated, and then how many people actually get convicted and sent to jail. It's like minuscule. So it's like, how is this as the solution really solving the problem? It's like we're not even solving the cases in the first place. So yeah.
I mean, one might just say like, let's just try it. Like, this hasn't been working, so like, let's give it a go. If in 5 years it seems like it's pandemonium, we've still got all these big buildings that we can put people in. If that seems like, you know, like there's no other option. Maybe longer than 5.
And we could definitely make huge improvements on the margins. You know, you get to that. I mean, I don't think we should be locking people up for drugs, right? But that's an easy one. Mm-hmm. When you get to murderers and rapists, it comes down to this question of, does the state have any legitimate power if it's not backed up by the threat of violence? You know, if we don't have the idea that we can lock you up, and if you try to escape, we're allowed to shoot you. You know, it makes you question if the whole thing stands up or not. Mm-hmm. There aren't any easy answers, but this book is a great jumping off point. And she wrote a book about 10 years later that is more about abolition and talks more about problems with immigration and torture that was done at the hands of the U.S. government and military. So I'm going to have to add that to my ever-growing list.
I know where you can get some books.
Oh, really? Is it Amazon?
Don't say that.
We can cut that part out of the video.
anybody
Well, great. I mean,
Any connection with Amazon and for the prison system? Gail mentioned earlier Walmart, I know, who uses a lot of prison labor. That's another aspect of prisons that's absolutely wild, is the amount of labor that,
Yes.
you know, it's basically a
Yeah.
textile chain gang, you know, it's still there. It's wild.
That was a revelation to me. I decided to disinvest from for-profit prisons and made that happen in my own personal financial investments. But then it was a Planned Parenthood newsletter right after Robin DiAngelo came out with her book that indicated 75 ways you can address white supremacy. And one of them was to disinvest from corporations and organizations that use prison labor. And the list was terrible because they're places I shop. And I don't know what to do next.
Yeah. And to me, kind of the frustrating thing about that is even like being able to remove those companies from your shopping list or, you know, wherever you go, like that is a privilege that a lot of people can't have. Like those companies, you know, are there because they offer like the cheapest way for your family to get the food and stuff they need. So it's like this whole other level of like grossness to the issue is like people are reliant on these companies.
I'm glad you mentioned that.
Yeah.
But it doesn't help my...
Oh yeah, no, and I totally agree. Like get them out of there where you can, but yeah, it's just proof that like it's so ingrained in our economy that it's really difficult.
They're most likely to go to prison have basically no choice but to shop at places that directly contribute to, you know, imprisonment and white supremacy and lobby in favor of more prisons. It's like,
well put.
Oh, it's brutal.
Yeah.
Well, this is why Marx says there's no ethical consumption under capitalism. As you go deep enough, and
ethical consumption.
That's why Karl Marx said there's no ethical consumption under capitalism, because you go deep enough and you hit one of those, you know, in one form or another.
Oh my. And that's where we are.
Yeah.
Good pick though, Bryce.
Yeah. I'd recommend it if you haven't read it or it's been a while. It was eye-opening.
It's the kind of book that I want to like give to various friends and family members. Like, here's just a short, concise little explanation of like all of this stuff. I don't have to. She explains it much better than I ever could.
Yeah, it's only about 100 pages. It's very doable, and it's not comprehensive. It can't cover everything, but it gives you so many different slices that really paint a broad strokes picture.
What year was it written in?
2003.
All right, you said that.
So it's old. 17 years old.
Yeah.
That's old for a book.
Yeah, well, yes and no.
I mean, there were parts where she would bring up statistics, and I was like, I got to look this up. I'm sure it's even worse today. And sometimes I couldn't find direct comparison. You know, I wanted to know how many people are in for-profit prisons, and it's not, or how many private prisons are there, and it's not always easy to even find those numbers.
No, I don't think they want to be found.
Right.
Yeah, those numbers don't want to be found.
Well, what's anybody else reading?
It's funny because the book I'm reading right now, besides Our Prison's Obsolete, is A Gentleman in Moscow. How do you say the last name of that, or the name of that author? Amor? It's A-M-O-R.
Oh, it's Owls?
Owls. Yeah, but I don't know how to say his first name, and I think he's like American or English. But anyway, so this is about a guy at the very end of like Tsarist Russia, like the Bolsheviks have just taken over, and he is imprisoned in his hotel that he's been living in, which is like the wealthiest hotel in Moscow, the Hotel Metropole. It's like, it has in the past been this, you know, social center of Russia. And he's imprisoned there for the rest of his life. They move him out of his big suite into like this little room. And it's an odd juxtaposition to reading about the American prison system. Because, I mean, he eats in the restaurant every day. He's like hanging out in this hotel. He meets this child who they like become buddies, and she's like, you know, getting him into all this trouble, whatever. But
what was his crime?
Connection until we started talking about this. But it's very, it's right up my alley. The writing feels like kind of like P.G. Wodehouse, like it's a little bit,
Yeah.
it's like a little bit nutty. Like there's like Kate, you know, they're always getting up to some kind of hijinks, and it's slightly antiquated language and beautifully written, and it's a fun read about somebody being in prison.
What was his crime?
What's that?
What was his crime?
I think his crime was just being a count.
Oh,
I don't think he actually committed a crime. I think he just was part of the aristocracy.
Yeah.
And instead of shooting him, but if he leaves the prison, they just will shoot him in the street. Or if he leaves the hotel, they're just going to shoot him. So instead of shooting him, for whatever reason, they decided they were just going to make him stay in this hotel for the rest of his life. So very anxious to see what happens in the end. I haven't finished it yet. But if you want to read a fun book about being imprisoned, this is the one.
Well, if it's like P.G. Wodehouse, yeah, it would be great. Sarcastic, ironic.
Yeah. Anybody else got anything good going on?
No, I'm reading The Mirror and the Light, Hilary Mantel's third part of that trilogy.
Oh, okay.
And Cromwell, I'm getting inside Cromwell's mind, and he keeps going back to Anne Boleyn and her head rolling off. I'm only in the first third of the book, but and you know his head is going to roll before the end of the book. So
Yeah.
I'm participating in his conversation with the king and all of the other courtiers. She's a brilliant writer. I'm just really involved in it.
What did that book just got nominated for?
Oh, did it?
The Booker Prize, maybe?
Booker.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
on the list for
Yes,
the Booker.
that's right.
I saw that yesterday. Yeah.
Brilliant
my
writer.
I feel like I need to go back to those. I think I read Wolf Hall in college or something, and I think it wasn't a good time to read it. I didn't really get into it, but I read a couple of her other ones and really liked them. So I need to go back to those. But right now I'm reading The Vanishing Half by Britt Bennett. So far
Are you
so
liking
good
it?
on that one. Yeah, I'm like 100 pages in maybe or so. It's a bit on the long side, but in a good way. I'm enjoying it.
Sounds great.
Micah, I think that's how your name is pronounced.
Micah.
What to do with people who are too dangerous to be in society and have to be separated for the protection of others. The point is protect society from dangerous people, then why is it necessary to impose a punishment?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's
Yeah.
again
that's right. All correct.
that thing about our social imagination of what is possible. I mean, what is a prison for? And if it's to isolate people who are for the safety of everyone else, yeah, I agree with you. But then what if they do escape? Then what do you do? How do you back that up?
Yeah.
Spiraling through the possibilities.
Catch him again. Yeah.
Ideally.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like overcorrecting. I mean, how many people, you know, it would be interesting to know, given a certain set of like parameters of safety of confinement, how many people do actually escape, and are we completely overcorrecting for like the possibility that like one person might escape? Like how often, I mean, it only really I've only ever heard of it happening in Coen Brothers movies.
Shawshank.
I mean, it's happened before. But, usually
It happened, but it's not like, it's not like 30 dangerous criminals a year escape from prison. It's like, I'd like to know what the edge is of like, possible restriction versus like, what's the actual risk of it? Or is it just like, it seems like people can create, kind of like the war on drugs created this like insane amount of fear of the risk when the risk was like a social problem and not that high. Like, I don't know.
It's definitely a creating enemies kind of thing.
Yeah, good thoughts though.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
And I was going to say, I don't think as many are, maybe not as many from like a penitentiary or reformatory as actually if they're in like a jail or they're awaiting their trial, that type of thing. It seems like you get more people that have escaped, at least in my opinion, I guess.
I guess I don't have any, I have no data to back up what I'm saying.
Yeah, I'm just going with what happens in New York State. So I can't say that for the country, but yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I think, we make this distinction of nonviolent and violent criminals, but a lot of the people that commit violence, it happens when they're young. It involves someone that they know. It's a crime of passion. They're not necessarily a danger for their entire lives. They're not necessarily a danger to anyone besides the person that they hurt when they made then they did something terrible. At the very least, we could be doing way more to get people out on the street safely.
And I mean, maybe a prison is acceptable for 0.1% of the population that's, extremely dangerous, extremely mentally unhealthy, chemically imbalanced, whatever, like maybe Jeffrey Dahmer can be in prison for the rest of his life and that's fine. But
But he died there, of course.
1%,
Yeah.
Yeah. Is anyone else here like a true crime
Yes.
person?
Yes,
That's
absolutely.
Like, that's the thing that I always get so like, it's hard to sort of like, hear about those kinds of, crimes and those kinds of people who commit those crimes and like, okay, well, yeah, I do want them to be in jail forever because they're terrible. Look at all the terrible things they did. But then, you realize like how tiny of a fraction those kind of crimes are compared to how many people we incarcerate. And it's like, okay, that's definitely like pointing out the exception to the rule.
Yeah,
and Orange is the New Black really outlined a lot of those differences between the truly violent criminal and the people who were in for minor offenses like drugs. I don't know whether that's still on Netflix or not, but it's worth watching the whole series. And it's all women prisoners, of course, but it outlines what goes on in other prisons as well. It's a microcosm.
All right, I'll watch it. My dad's been trying to tell me to watch it for like the entire time it's been on, and I've been
started
now the Kiel says it, I'll do it. Fine. Susie, what are you reading right now?
Well, I'm reading White Fragility for my book study, and it has given me. I'm not halfway through it yet, but it has certainly given me a lot to think about. And I'm really anxious for the group for my book study to talk about the book and how they felt about it. And yeah, it's excellent, I think.
I can't wait to hear what they think about it.
You have to come.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Are there any people of color in your book group, Susie?
There are not.
That'll be interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, bunch of white ladies sitting around talking about privilege.
Bunch of old white ladies.
White ladies.
Like our book group. Bunch of white ladies, usually Bryce, usually James. Bryce and James holding it down.
Yeah.
Where is James anyway? He's not here.
I know. It's the first one.
Busy cooking.
Yeah, he's probably cooking. Denise, what are you reading?
I just started A Year of Dangerous Days. So that was the Miami, Florida in 1980, right after they started the war on drugs with Reagan. The boatloads from Mariel were coming in, that type of thing, how things changed so radically in such a short amount of time.
What's the name of it?
Oh, go ahead.
The title again?
A Year of Dangerous Days. A Year of Dangerous Days. Yeah, like I said again, I lived down there. I lived in Florida from 1980 to 1983, so it was kind of interesting. You know, it brings back things that you hadn't thought of for a lot of years, I guess.
Interesting. What happened? I don't know anything about that. So the war on drugs started, and then what?
With the book?
Yeah. What's the?
You had the war on drugs started, Reagan, 1980.
Right.
You also they did the boat lifts over from Cuba, the Mariel boat lifts, where they had they sent over actually they did the gates of the prison and sent everybody over, and there were people with mental issues and things like that. So it's interesting.
Wild.
Bryce, did you tell us your book? What you're reading now?
No, I just finished this one under the wire, but the one that I read before, the last book I read before this was The Glass Hotel, the Emily St. John Mandel, which I know a lot of you have probably read or were here for the talk. But
did you like
she's
it?
so great. I loved it, and there's something about a really good novel that I can't tell you what's good about it. I just really enjoyed it and wanted to read the next page.
You cared about the characters.
Yeah. You'd be introduced to someone who's totally tangential to the story you thought you were hearing. It'll jump forward in time and back in time, but somehow it all works. She's great.
Did you read?
Sorry, go ahead, Gail.
I just want to know if you read Station 11.
I did read Station 11, and I think I still like that one a little bit more. But this one made me really excited for what she'll continue to do.
Yeah.
I think her first book is the Lola Quartet, and I thought that was fine, but it didn't come together for me in the same way as these two.
What kind of quartet?
Lola, the name Lola. Yeah.
Lola Quartet.
It's entertaining.
Yeah. Does she do the same thing in Station 11 where, a lot of characters come in and out and they're sort of related and then sometimes they disappear and never come back again? That felt very true to life to me, like somebody comes in, like they start with her brother and he's very important for 1.5 chapters and then he's just like kind of there sometimes.
Right, and then he doesn't show up till the end of the book.
Yeah,
I love that.
Very real life to me, like people are there for the time that they're there and then they disappear and they're important sometimes and, not central to your life and other times. Does she do that? She does that in her other books?
To me, that'd be the only major similarity between the two books because they're not really about the same sort of things at all. Also, in The Glass Hotel, people sort of lose touch with each other, sort of partly by design and partly by fortune, but in Station 11, it's because they didn't have a way to contact the people who were dead because of the pandemic or were isolated from them on another continent or whatever.
Right.
But yeah, she does that really well.
Yeah, she's good. Only 30.
You know who else does that well is Tana French. Dublin. She introduces characters and then she transfers them to the next book, and they're more important in the next book. And then you go back to the other book to see what they did before. I've read 2 of her books twice. I just can't get over it.
I feel like if I was gonna write
nobody else, huh?
That's what I would want to do.
Yeah.
I get so interested in one of the tangential characters and then you get to write a whole book about that person. That seems like a really interesting way to go about it. Create this whole world. Well, guys, it's been great.
It is 6:30.